2,000 pages of reading later, and I'm either going to have a very deep self-reflection about how I hate women, or Murakami might not be the bad guy that we think he is.
Right. I want my baby back, baby back, baby back, baby back, baby back.
Hey, hi, hello. My name is Fats, and we are talking Haruki Murakami today. The man, the myth, the legend, the misogynist. We'll get to that later. But first, before we get into the books, let's talk about Murakami himself. Murakami was born January 12th of 1949, around the post-World War II baby boom. He was born in Nishinomiya, Ashiya, and Kobe. He was an only child to two parents. Both of his parents actually did teach Japanese literature. His father was a Buddhist priest, and his mother was the daughter of an Osaka merchant. His father is actually a great influence in a lot of Murakami's writing because he was actively within the Sino-Japanese War and came out deeply traumatized by it. So the Sino-Japanese War is the war between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan between 1937 and 1945, directly before Murakami was actually born. It is the largest Asian war of the 20th century, and some people in history have referred to it as the Asian Holocaust. His father was involved in that, and his mother was also, of course, involved by way of being married to him, as well as living within the world of this horrible, gruesome war. And Murakami came out of the desolation that was that. So the concept of life, the concept of love, understanding, relationship, comes from a place of Murakami's past and Murakami's history. And a lot of this self-reflection and almost dread that comes with the continuation forward, you can see in his writing. We'll get to that later. Promise. Some of Murakami's influences are that of Western culture. Some of his favorite authors were actually Franz Kafka, Gustav Flaubert, Dickens, Kurt Vonnegut, and Dostoevsky. And it is through these influences that Murakami became most well-known and stood out the most as a Japanese author. Within these influences, it is almost impossible to talk about what motivates and drives and inspires Murakami without also talking about music. I did make sure to track all of the music influences and all of the music references throughout the books that I read, just so you can see how he is also playing to setting the scene. Right out of college, well, right just before graduating college, he had worked within a record store, and then him and his wife had actually opened up a jazz bar record store type of situation before he became a writer. So music is so deeply woven into Murakami's lifestyle, and that is what, yet again, another thing that he takes into his writing, his stories, and a lot of what he weaves into his own character's life. You're going to see a lot of characters that work within record stores, spend time at record stores. The motif of the record store is so prevalent within Murakami's writing, but he holds that dearly to him himself. Now, when it comes to writing, Murakami says that his first story came to him out of nowhere. He never saw himself as a writer. And it was actually a future he never wanted for himself. He was very content, except for one day, him and his wife were out watching baseball, and the story flew to him. It came to him, and he went home, and he immediately had to start writing. He then submitted this story, which was called Hear the Wind Sing, which he wrote in 1979, submitted that to a literary contest, won that contest, and then he set everything down and started his path as wanting to become a writer. By 1985, some of Murakami's biggest works started coming out, in which he wrote Hard-Boiled Wonderland at the End of the World, which was this dreamlike fantasy that really solidified Murakami as this magical realism author. By 1987, he wrote Norwegian Wood, a book that I also read, and this is so notable because this was the book that made Murakami so famous that he actually moved out of Japan, lived in America, lived around Europe because he wanted to escape paparazzi and being so well known. Norwegian Wood was what propelled him into the spotlight. Stylistically, before we get into these books, there is something that I just want to bring up to set the scene of the origin of his writing and what he's going into when it comes to writing. When Murakami writes a story, he specifically says that he does so without the intention of reasoning, without a plot. He lets the characters exist and just lets the story happen. He has no beginning, middle, or end. He opens up at a start and he opens up with a cast and he lets that go forward. Now, one thing that is said about Japanese writing is when you write in a first-person narrative, that I, me, we, in the tradition of the Japanese I novel, this is called shishosetsu or watakushi shosetsu, which is confessional literature. This is the overhead of what Murakami writes. He uses that I. But in Japanese language, there are several different I's and several different purposes for this confession. Within the Meiji period of naturalism, the use of these different I's were either to greater bring out individualism, remove these constraints of methodology, or allow for a more expository writing style. This is to say that within these stories, Murakami is actively suppositing himself within these stories. Just like I said with those record stores, like I said with his understanding of life, it is confessional. Now, why does this matter? Why do I bring up the Japanese I? Why do I bring up the I novel? For one reason, and it's something that I'm going to take going forward as of this second, and also something that I want to say is almost a caveat to how I am approaching this discussion of Murakami. The Japanese I and the formal watashi symbol in Japanese language has the weight of reality and sincerity. There is an understanding that what he is writing is honest. There is an honesty to these stories, and there is no aspect of a hidden meaning or ulterior motives within these stories. The watashi I, that formal I, which Murakami does often use, is intended to mean sincerity, is intended to propose the sincerity. So as you read and as you have that I narrative and that I character, the way that they are viewing these characters and the way that things are happening within this surrealistic world, you have to take it as honest, sincere, and true. There is no aspect of an unreliable narrator when it comes to Murakami due to the forming and the formality of the Japanese characters. We in English don't have this, which is why I wanted to bring it up. If you read these and you're like, oh, I don't trust him. Oh, he's hiding something. Oh, this character is not treating this other character with sincerity. He's using her. If your character is not saying that and your character is not denoting that, there is a trust that you have to give to your characters due to the use of the Japanese watashi I. That is how I will be approaching these, due to that framework. If that is incorrect, however, literature is for your own understanding, and it is for your own lens. If you feel more connected to a story in which the character is more unreliable and you don't trust them, do that. That it is your reading experience. This is just how I am approaching this discussion. I also have one more caveat when discussing these books, and it relates to writing style. Let me just bring it up because I want to get to these books so badly. When it comes to these books and when I talk style, form, feeling, vibes, this is a translated work. It's translated. So when I'm talking about how boring something might be or how something might be worded, it's almost as if Murakami is free of my critique and it falls very heavily on the translator. Or there is equal weight and equal responsibility to be taken when I discuss how it's written and how sentences are formed and how characters come off, because it is translated. But This is another thing that makes Murakami interesting, and also what has propelled him to popularity in Japan, this aspect of translationese. In the Paris Review, it is said here, in Novelist as a Vocation, Murakami says he developed his own original writing style little by little, specifically by reading foreign novels. Either in translation and the original, he has also said that having read very few Japanese novels, he didn't have a firm idea of what a Japanese novel was when he first tried writing one himself. In a different interview, and as well as in a different article, in a discussion of how he writes, Murakami has said, since I was born and raised in Japan, the vocabulary and patterns of the Japanese language had filled the system that was me to bursting, like a barn crammed with livestock. When I sought to put my thoughts and feelings into words, those animals began to mill about, and the system crashed. Writing in a foreign language with all the limitations that entailed removed this obstacle. Murakami is discussing how the way he wrote his novels was he wrote in English and then translated his English into Japanese. Then from there, a translator took that Japanese and put it back into English, which is such a weird way. But Japanese, the way I just spoke to you about how there are several different eyes within a story, several different eyes within Japanese language, there's so much that comes with the use of a symbol, and there's so much depth that English just doesn't get into. And Murakami simplified the process by writing in English first and then moving to Japanese. He goes forward in the article to say, when I was seeking by writing first in English and then translating into Japanese was no less than the creation of an unadorned neutral style that would allow me freer movement. My interest was not in creating a watered down form of Japanese. I wanted to deploy a type of Japanese as far removed as possible from the so-called literary language in order to write in my own natural voice. Before we even get into the writing, I'm just going to say that neutrality, that sterility, you feel that. But again, as the story has gone through this language factory of going from English to symbols to English to symbols, there is a lot lost. But Murakami did that intentionally. He wanted to free himself of the stringencies of Japanese by taking on a inferior language. I can say that a lot of these stories did have a very choppy feeling, but Japanese literature translated into English always has a very different feel. So I can't even say this is Murakami itself. Let's get into these books. I'm going to start off this conversation with Norwegian Wood. This is a story of Toru Watanabe, a young man, a college student at university who is living his life following the, I will be using side so that I don't get flagged from YouTube. And I don't think I can say the full word, so I will just be saying side from this moment forth. Because there's quite a bit of it in this story, actually. Following the side of a high school best friend. In this, he comes into a very complicated relationship with that high school best friend's girlfriend. That high school best friend's girlfriend then enters into a living situation to help her with her own mental health. This story follows Toru Watanabe as he falls into relationships, uses sex as a means of masking his pain. It becomes one of those, if you can't get over someone, get under someone else. And he makes these friends who also have the same mindset. He makes friends with another man who's cheating on his girlfriend. He has this weird characters as roommates, and he lives in this dirty dorm room, and he meets another woman at the home with the ex high school best friend's girlfriend. And it just becomes this path of Toru Watanabe struggling with depression. It isn't said outright, but it's the concept of depression here is worded as a sort of disease. A sort of contagious sickness is how this is said. I don't know if this is the actual word used. Again, this is translated. I don't know what word is intended. This is what J. Rubin gave me. J. Rubin being the translator for this work. But the story actually opens up with a middle-aged Toru reflecting on his past. And it says here, memory is a funny thing. When I was in the scene, I hardly paid it any mind. I never stopped to think of it as something that would make a lasting impression. Certainly never imagined that 18 years later, I would recall it in such detail. I didn't give a damn about the scenery that day. I was thinking about myself. I was thinking about the beautiful girl walking next to me. I was thinking about the two of us together and then about myself again. It was the age, the time of life when every sight, every feeling, every thought came back like a boomerang to me. And worse, I was in love. Love with complications. Scenery was the last thing on my mind. He's reflecting on a day that he went on a walk with the girlfriend of that high school friend. Her name is Naoko. Now, she is a very central figure within this story, but she doesn't show up too often. She is actually very much a letter writer, a reflectory element, but when it comes to her presence within the actual story, she isn't there often. She does show up and have small bits of conversation, and also is this romantic focus of Toru. But not so much because he likes her. She's a romantic interest because he feels a sense of guilt at who she has lost, who he has lost, that trauma bonding of that. And also there was one day when they were extremely intoxicated on her birthday that they had sex. And Toru feels a sense of guilt for that interaction. So he has this love for her, but very much wound up in a sense of guilt and responsibility. That is what you're following through with this story. Now, some things that you get from this is a whole cast of very unlikable characters. You get Nagasawa, who is cheating on his girlfriend. And here is an initial scene discussing Nagasawa. He was a great talker. Not that he had anything great to say, but girls would get carried away listening to them. They'd drink too much and end up sleeping with him. I guess they enjoyed being with someone so nice and handsome and clever. And the most amazing thing was that just because I was with him, I seemed to become as fascinating to them as he was. Nagasawa would urge me to talk, and girls would respond to me with the same smiles of admiration they gave him. His magic did it. A real talent he had that impressed me every time. Compared with Nagasawa, Kazuki, his high school friend. Kazuki's conversational gift was child's play. This was a whole different level of accomplishment. As much as I found myself caught up in Nagasawa's power, though, I missed Kazuki. I felt a new admiration for his sincerity. Whatever talents he had, he could share with Naoko and me alone, while Nagasawa was bent on disseminating his considerable gifts all around him. Not that he was dying to sleep with the girls he found. It was just a game to him. Now, it's almost unfair to hold Toru to the crassness that is Nagasawa. In the beginning, he did see him as this magical man with so many interesting abilities as a wooer of women. However, as Toru grows and as Toru spends more time with him and as Toru matures a little bit, he starts to see that Nagasawa isn't a great person. It becomes this sense of understanding, because at first he saw them on this pedestal, this man that could woo women by just laughing and talking. And Nagasawa would say, all you have to do to get a woman is get her a little drunk. They're out at the bar because they want someone to sleep with them. Toru sleeps around. It's college. It's what you do. He bounces around in women in this story, and and a lot of his romantic interests actually bring it up. Let's talk about the parts I don't like about this book. This story exists in like an effervescent nonchalance. There is this aspect of quirkiness, I would say, to how you read the story, but at the same time, there is a very detached nature of Toru. There's a character that always says, you talk funny. Oh, the way you're so blunt. Everybody's always picking out how blunt and how Toru talks funny, how he's always so forefront. And at the same time, having Toru as the eyes in which we follow this story, you don't feel a connection to anyone. This love that he has for Naoko doesn't feel quite real, and this interactions that he has and the conversation that he has, you always feel so removed from who he interacts with, and you feel, I would say, even removed from the story itself. And I want to say that this horrible detachment from the character works against the story, but if I had to put a theme to what you're experiencing in the story, I would say it would be the outward masks that people wear, this outward smile, this outward understanding, this outward personage that you put on for other people. And Toru just so happens to be the person that is struggling and doesn't have that mask. And as you're discussing depression and sadness, this sickness, that outward mask becomes a huge theme. Now, Naoko, she does commit side. Kazuki had committed side. The girlfriend that his horrible cheating friend, the one that said you can just get women at the bar, she commits side. And the Naoko, the love interest, her older sister had committed side. There is just death after death after death. But with something like side, to have such a detached nature, Toru's concept of grief and how he talks about these people and how he relates to loss of human life feels empty. However, with the fact that there is this sincerity and we are using this formatting that requires you see sincerity and honesty in the characters, the fact that Toru says he feels sadness, even though he isn't expressing it and you aren't seeing it outward, you almost have to assume that he too has this mask. He grapples multiple times with this sense of dissociation. He constantly is sitting there and he detaches from his surroundings. And while it isn't outwardly said, you do have to sort of glean these hints that he is struggling as well. However, one thing that I'm going to continuously say about these stories is this feels like it could have been a short story. That's my biggest gripe with Murakami, and I'm going to say it over and over again today. This felt like a short story being dragged almost 300 pages through this. It felt like, I don't know, you can see that Murakami has no intent with his story. You can see that. But Norwegian Wood, the reason I'm glad that I read this one was music. Norwegian Wood itself is a song by the Beatles, a song that really, really holds on to this melancholic nature, this reflective sadness. And as a title and as a theme, I think that is important. But when you get the scene with the namesake, you have Naoko in that home that's helping her get better with her roommate, and the roommate plays guitar. And here is the scene. "Play Norwegian Wood," said Naoko. Reiko brought a porcelain beckoning cat from the kitchen. It was a coin bank, and Naoko dropped a 100 yen piece from her purse into its slot. "What's this all about?" I asked. "It's a rule," said Naoko. "When I request Norwegian Wood, I have to put 100 yen in the bank. It's my favorite, so I make a point of paying for it. I make a request when I want to hear it. And that way I get my cigarette money," said Ryoko. Ryoko gave her fingers a good flexing and then played Norwegian Wood. Again, she paid with real feeling, but never allowed it to become sentimental. I took a 100 yen coin from my pocket and dropped it into the bank. "Thank you," said Ryoko with a sweet smile. That song can make me feel so sad, said Naoko. I don't know. I guess I imagine myself wandering in a deep wood. I'm all alone, and it's cold and dark, and nobody comes to save me. That's why Ryoko never plays it unless I request it. You can't talk about Norwegian Wood, though, without talking about the ending. So, near the ending, Naoko had taken her own life. And her roommate had been sending letters to Toru about how it's not his fault. He can't blame himself. There's no need to have guilt over it, right? And he goes off to get a job in the middle of nowhere, deal with his demons, and become a man. The roommate visits him, and they have sex. It is the most awkward sex scene on this earth. There's literally a moment where she's talking about how wrinkly she is, and he reaches down to her lady bits, and she's like, LOL, stop, that's a wrinkle. And he's like, don't make jokes like that. So him and the roommate have that moment. And then he, after he had left school, didn't go back, actually calls a girl that he had a sort of situationship with back in college, and calls her, and he's like, hey, I'm sorry. Please call me back. I want to be with you. You're the person I want. But here's the scene. I telephoned Midori, the girl he had a situationship with back in college. I have to talk to you, I said. I have a million things to talk about. A million things we have to talk about. All I want in this world is you. I want to see you and talk. I want the two of us to begin everything from the beginning. Midori responded with a long, long silence. The silence of all the misty rain in the world falling on all the new mown lawns of the world. Forehead pressed against the glass, I shut my eyes and waited. At last, Midori's quiet voice broke the silence. Where are you now? Where was I now? Gripping the receiver, I raised my head and turned to see what lay beyond the telephone booth. Where was I now? I had no idea at all. Where was this place? All that flashed into my eyes were the countless shapes of people walking by to nowhere. Again and again, I called out for Midori from the dead center of this place that was no place. I reread the last section 4 times, and then I delved deep into Goodreads, and I delved even deeper into Reddit, and I could not find any explanation for this ending. As I was going through Norwegian Wood, this was the very first book that I read of Murakami, and I wasn't necessarily disliking my experience, but that ending really ticked me off. I don't know what it was. It's so unsatisfactory, but in a story of masks, in a story of presenting yourself, in a story of showing who you want people to see that you are, it feels almost right that we get this empty feint of an ending. I don't know, something about that. Like, I was going with it and I was going with it and I was going with it. And then it just felt like Murakami was like, oh yeah, backhand. Like, it just really smacked me to end that way. It wasn't like you have those stories that end on this magical sort of cliffhanger. This didn't feel like that. This was a crime. I hated that ending. And to take something that I felt like was doing some things, all the deaths and all in the messiness that was the relationship and all the really weird sex scenes, I couldn't quite get on board with it. But the points in between all the weird sex and all of the characters that I just didn't like, I think I enjoyed the story. But the ending made me just say, like, F this. But I ended it feeling like I was dumb. Not getting the ending, I ended it feeling like I was dumb, and I just needed a moment. But after taking several moments, I just had to close it and deal with that dissatisfaction. And Norwegian Wood really felt as if there was this huge lack of attention given to characters. Now, in a lot of different discussions that I saw that disliked Norwegian Wood, it was often said that having Toru at the center of the story and then having all of these female characters that are just so desperate to have sex with him, so desperate to be a part of his story. And then these women almost propel his story forward and they act as this tool. A lot of people, in what is the common complaint against Murakami, say that he is a misogynist. But just in the act of defining terms and making sure that I'm not incorrect in what I think, the just Webster definition for misogynistic is a hatred of or prejudice against women. A feeling showing or characterized by hatred of or prejudice against women, of or relating to being a misogynistic, attitudes or behaviors. If a person is misogynistic, it is said by Merriam-Webster, a person who hates or discriminates against women. A misogynistic person. These comments attempt to cut much deeper, striking women at what misogynists see as their most valuable characteristics: appearance, sexual purity, sweetness, and submissiveness. That is misogynistic. The hatred of and discrimination against women. Now, hear me out. I'm going to read a few things on the male gaze. In an essay by Anna M. Balkas, The Monstrosity of the Male Gaze, she says, in the Victorian era, women were expected to maintain sexual purity and submissiveness to be considered respectable. Women who violated these norms became known as fallen women, a term used to describe prostitutes, the lower class, or homeless people. However, the late 19th century introduced a new feminist ideal where women sought liberation by pushing against these oppressive gender norms. They took on new roles fighting for women's suffrage, becoming educated and working against the home. These women began to exhibit characteristics of independence, intelligence, and a free-spirited nature, giving rise to the New Woman movement. But despite the illusion of freedom presented by these new ideals, women remain trapped by the male gaze, a concept coined by film critic Laura Mulvey in 1975 to explain patriarchal ideologies and discourses. The male gaze originates from the male heterosexual perception of society, creating a lens that both objectifies and sexualizes women. In contrast to traditional misogyny and patriarchal boundaries, the male gaze operates in a more subtle manner through literature and other media, requiring a viewer, either presented by an author, an audience, or the male characters. Expectations set by the male gaze not only objectify women, but also cause them to internalize their self-worth as dependent on men's perceptions of them. In another article that goes into the discussion of the European nude, it is said, for Berger, a studier of the European nude, these images record the inequality of gender relations and a sexualization of the female image that remains culturally central today. They reassure men of their sexual power and at the same moment, deny any sexuality of women other than the male construction. They are evidence of gendered difference, because any effort to replace the woman in these images with a man violates the assumptions of the likely viewer. That is, it does not fit with expectations, but transgresses them, and so seems wrong. The male gaze implies something watching and something to be watched. That is what the male gaze is. Whereas a misogynistic person has intent. When you read a story and women are presented in this sexualized manner, this is by no means only that of Murakami's books. Look to superheroes. Look to anime. There are so many scenes in which you can understand the male gaze and you can see that there is a person who has motives, intent, background, and a story. However, due to how we are viewing them as written by a patriarchal institution, a person influenced by the patriarchal institution, that character will be viewed through a certain light, and that character will be positioned in a certain light. It's to see an anime character and say this is misogyny is to imply that you know the intent of the drawer. And sometimes as a reader, I think it is incorrect to fill in the holes. Am I saying that he doesn't hate women? I don't know. I can't say that. I see a sexualized character. I see something and I can see that this is the male gaze. I can see that this is a male fantasy. I can see that this is what a man would want. And I can see that our men exist within this fantastical thing of big boobs and pretty little thin legs. I see that. But I cannot read between the lines and imply an author's intent. And goodness, I'm so sorry to have to be the devil's advocate on this one. I don't want to be. I really don't, but not all instances of the male gaze are misogyny. Because unfortunately, we haven't had moments where Murakami has just said, yeah, I hate women. But in an interview, he does discuss this. Murakami sits down with Meiko Kawakami, and she is a proclaimed feminist. I'm actually going to reference this interview multiple times in this discussion because this was such a great interview and she really asked the hard questions. Meiko Kawakami brings up women as novelistic instruments, which is seen and heavily argued against in Norwegian Wood. Meiko Kawakami says, a common reading is that your male characters are fighting their battles unconsciously, on the inside, leaving women to do the fighting in the real world. Murakami responds, I think that pattern is probably coincidental. At a minimum, I never set things up like that on purpose. I guess it's possible for a story to work out that way on a purely unconscious level. Not to sound dismissive, but my writing doesn't follow any kind of clear-cut scheme. Take Norwegian Wood, where Naoko and Midori are respectively grappling with their subconscious and conscious existences. The first-person male character is captivated by them both, and it threatens to split his world in two. Then there's After Dark. We'll discuss that one later. The story is propelled almost exclusively by the will of the female character, so I can't agree that women are always stuck playing the supporting role of sexual oracles or anything along those lines. Even once I've forgotten the storylines, these women stay with me. Like Reiko Hatsumi in Norwegian Wood. Even now, thinking about them makes me emotional. These women aren't just novelistic instruments for me. Each individual work calls for its own circumstances. I'm not making excuses. I'm speaking from feeling and experience. But Kawakami doesn't want to drop the topic. She goes further and she says, as long as sex is being positioned as a way into unfamiliar realm, the women, when faced with a heterosexual protagonist, have basically no choice but to play the role of sexual partner. She's discussing the fact that when a female character exists in these stories, she is a whole for our male character. There's no point in which a male character knows a female character and sex isn't introduced, or she isn't begging for sex, or she isn't sexualizing herself. That's what Kawakami is discussing. Murakami says, I'm not sure I follow. Kawakami says back, I'm talking about the number of female characters who exist solely to fulfill a sexual function. On the one hand, your work is boundlessly imaginative when it comes to plots, to wells, and to men, but the same can't be said for your relationships with women. It's not possible for these women to exist on their own. And while female protagonists or even supporting characters may enjoy a moderate degree of self-expression, thanks to their relative independence, there's a persistent tendency for women to be sacrificed for the sake of the male leads. So the question is, why is it that women are so often called upon to play this role in Murakami novels? Murakami responds, "This may not be the most satisfying explanation, but I don't think any of my characters are that complex. The focus is on the interface, or how these people, both men and women, engage with the world they're living in. If anything, I take great care not to dwell too much on the meaning of existence, its importance, or its implications. Like I said earlier, I'm not interested in individualistic characters, and that applies to men and women both." We have an author who gives no cusses about positioning himself as woke. This man just is coming in here and being a man. And it's unfair almost for us to fill in blanks and say that, man, there's a whole lot of sex in here and a whole lot of boobs. He hates women. He just likes boobs. This guy likes boobs. And again, I hate playing devil's advocate for this. I really didn't want to. I wanted to come in here and tell you all about how misogynistic Murakami was and pick apart all of these female characters. But if we're going to talk about a female character, let's talk about one that I think Murakami actually did pretty interestingly, and that she had agency. And here is the absolute tome that is 1Q84. So if I had to try to explain this story, structurally, this book is an almost dissonant sort of reflection, very much funhouse mirror reflection. And that's how you get this multi-leveled parallel universe type world. I would say what the reading experience was odd because while a bulky book, it moved like it was like light on its feet. This was a very nimble read while being such a large book. You open up with 29-year-old physical therapist and part-time hitwoman, Aomame, who tumbles into this strange bilunar reality. So she was in this standstill traffic on the freeway. And in order to get around this traffic, she tells her taxi driver, I'm just going to get out and I'm going to descend these stairs. And that is how she enters into this alternate universe. On the other end of things, you have Tango. And Tango is a teacher of fiction who slips into this world as he is rewriting a story written by a mysterious high school girl. I would say that one thing about this book, while I did say it's nimble, it moves, it's pliable, this book was a shaggy dog of a book. And let me explain what I mean by that. You have this huge fluffy dog. And when you shave its hair away, you have just this tiny little skinny rat, right? That's usually what happens with some of these breeds. That was a story because this was a love story. This wasn't some epic Byzantine story, this epic Byzantine adventure. This was a love story of Tango and Aomame who had known each other in the past and by the end of the book come back together. And there is a scene here in the discussion of this world itself. And I want to say that as you descend into this bilunar world, there's almost a sense of like grogginess that I had while reading this. A sense of I was woken up from a nap and I was trudging through this story half awake with like sand crusties in my eyes. This shaggy dog, groggy mist of a story was what happened for these 1,300 pages. I would say that what made this story nimble were the stakes, I would say. I would say the stakes made this feel very nimble. But before I get into this section, I want to talk about the difference between magical realism and surrealism. Now, the difference between these two is magical realism is a blending of magical elements seamlessly into what is an otherwise ordinary, recognizable world. Surrealism is more dreamlike and detached from reality, often exploring the subconscious mind through bizarre imagery and juxtapositions. Murakami is very much magical realism, and I think that of all the books that I read of his, there was no point in which I was like, this is more surrealist. No, this is a very much a world that is grounded in reality, because even in this book, you're in all of these other worlds, but it's almost grounded by references to real life things. The fact that 1Q84 is 1984 by George Orwell, and the fact that you have the Russo-Manchurian War referenced in here. There are moments in which it gives you a calling back to the fact that you're grounded into a real history, real literature, real pop culture references. Now, there is a character who is otherwise very disreputable, but has these huge moments of self-awareness. He even says in a different part of the story, principles and logic don't give birth to reality. Reality came first and principles and logic followed. What the real world is, that is a very difficult problem, the man called Leader said as he lay on his stomach. What it is a metaphysical proposition, but this is the real world. There is no doubt about that. The pain one feels in this world is real pain. Deaths caused in this world are real deaths. Blood shed in this world is real blood. There's no imitation world, no imaginary world, no metaphysical world. I guarantee you that. But this is not the 1984 you know. The parallel world. The man's shoulders trembled with laughter. You've been reading too much science fiction. No, this is no parallel world. You don't have 1984 over there and 1Q84 branching off over here, and the two worlds running along parallel tracks. The year 1984 no longer exists anywhere. For you and for me, the only time that exists anymore is this year of 1Q84. Again, referring to this as this shaggy dog read and sitting with this feeling that this book is contemporary rootlessness, I felt, again, very dissatisfied to have a story that created a world and brought a world into being for the purpose of destroying it. For an entire system of belief to be undermined, and for the central meaning of the story to just be love wins overall. I just hit a point where, again, I don't know, I was taken on this adventure for there to just be no big bang, almost. It was like oh, LOL, we went on this big long walk for nothing. Let's get into After Dark. This one, I have the least to say. That feeling of I needed this book to be a short story. I felt this with After Dark. The only thing I can say about this one is Murakami experimented with form in this. This book follows a singular night in which 19-year-old girl Mari is hanging out reading a book, bumps into a guy, and then that guy leaves. And then that guy tells a friend that Mari speaks Chinese. So that friend asks Mari to come help them translate to a Chinese prostitute who had been beaten. And then you switch scenes to Mari's sister, who has said that she's going to sleep her life away at home. And that sister sleeps and then gets teleported into the TV and then teleported back into her bed. But in the TV, there's a man watching her. And then you are in another POV of the man that had hit the Chinese prostitute that Mari is helping people translate for. That is what happens in this book. That is all that happens in this book. Stylistically, it is very much written like a play. Very much written like a play. And you have this weird you dictation. It's a second person being told, we do this, and then you think this. You're being told how to feel, told what to think. It's filling in the blanks for you. I didn't enjoy it. I thought it was whack. I did not have a good time. I don't have much to say about it.
I can't believe this is happening!
Then I bet you weren't expecting this.
No!
Aha!
Oh, okay.
Where's the other guy? Yo!
Sorry I'm late. So, what'd I miss?
Oh my goodness. Goodness gracious, I'm so sorry. My camera died and the sun sets at 5:30 p.m. here, so change of lighting, my bad. I hope you can see me. If not, I'm really just doing the best I can. So, where were we? The Elephant Vanishes, the short story collection that I read. Now, so many of these books felt so empty to me. So I do want to say that my most enjoyable experiences were from these last two books that I'm going to talk about. The Elephant Vanishes is a short story collection that really plays to almost a sort of interior lesson being within each of these stories. And I would say that it was so interesting going from all of these that felt as if Murakami were just kind of vibing at his desk, and then to come to a short story collection where he had intent and purpose with a lot of the stories. I'm going to put up my personal ranking for each of the stories up on the screen, just so that you know which was better than the other. The TV one was absolutely horrible. I just did not enjoy that as a story. But there are two stories that I do want to talk about. The first being the second bakery attack. This one was my favorite. It was just a story of a husband and wife who wake up and they're absolutely famished, but they go through the house, realize that they don't have any food, and then the husband tells the wife a story of how when he was younger, he and some friends had robbed a bakery. The wife is then very much like, oh, we should do that, and she procures a gun and some masks, and they go on the hunt for some bakery items. And it's really just this story of like this everlasting curse, this hunger, this need, whatever. I just don't know what it was, but I enjoyed the writing of this. So that is the point in which I kept track of who the translators were. Because like I said, it's difficult to give Murakami credit for writing style when the translators have such a large effect. Now, my least favorites were After Dark and Norwegian Wood. Both of these are translated by J. Rubin. Now, J. Rubin worked with Philip Gabriel in 1Q84, and Philip Gabriel was the main translator of Sputnik Sweetheart. And I don't know what it was, but the Gabriel books were the ones that I liked the most. And because I'm not somebody who is fluent in Japanese, I can't even see what that process was, but I would say that it's so apparent to me how much more I enjoyed the reading experience of, I didn't necessarily love these books, but the way the words flowed together was better for me for the ones that were Philip Gabriel. I didn't have much to say about the short story collection. Just that I did enjoy the fact that these stories felt more purposeful. But in order to talk about how much I enjoy the Philip Gabriel more, I marked out just a random section in Sputnik Sweetheart, and then I'll give you a little chat about Sputnik Sweetheart as a whole. It says, mind you, again, this is this first-person narrative, but you don't get a discussion of your narrator until page 54. Here's that introduction. It's time to say a few words about myself. Of course, the story is about Sumire, not me. Still, I'm the one whose eyes the story is told through. The tale of who Sumire is and what she did, and I should explain a little about the narrator, me, in other words. I find it hard to talk about myself. I'm always tripped up by the eternal who am I paradox. Sure, no one knows as much pure data about me as me. But when I talk about myself, all sorts of other factors, values, standards, my own limitations as an observer, make me, the narrator, select and eliminate things about me, the narratee. I've always been disturbed by the thought that I'm not painting an everyday picture of myself. This kind of thing doesn't seem to bother most people. Given the chance, people are surprisingly frank when they talk about themselves. I'm honest and open to a ridiculous degree, they'll say. Or, I'm thin-skinned and not the type who gets along easily in the world. Or, I'm very good at sensing others' true feelings. But any number of times I've seen people who say they're easily hurt other people for no apparent reason. Self-styled, honest and open people, without realizing what they're doing, blithely use some self-serving excuse to get what they want. And those good at sensing others' true feelings are duped by the most transparent flattery. It's enough to make me ask the question, how well do we really know ourselves? The more I think about it, the more I'd like to take a rain check on the topic of me. What I'd like to know more about is the objective reality of things outside of myself, how important the world outside is to me, how I maintain a sense of equilibrium by coming to terms with it. That's how I'd grasp a clearer sense of who I am. These are the kinds of ideas I had running through my head when I was a teenager. Like a master builder stretches taut his string and lays one brick after another, I constructed this viewpoint or philosophy of life to put a bigger spin on it. Logic and speculation played a part in formulating this viewpoint. But for the most part, it was based on my own experiences. And speaking of experience, a number of painful episodes taught me that getting this viewpoint of mine across to other people wasn't the easiest thing in the world. This is so much different. Let me just find a section of After Dark, which is a J. Rubin. I just had something fall out. The TV image comes and goes, but its stability slowly increases. On screen is the interior of a room, a fairly big room. It could be a space in an office building or some kind of classroom. It has a large plate glass window. Banks of fluorescent lights line the ceiling. That's a section of this. And then we read Norwegian Wood earlier, but just so you can hear them all back to back. To tell you the truth, Naoko went on, I loved his weak side too. I loved it as much as I loved his good side. There was absolutely nothing mean or sneaky about him. He was weak, that's all. I tried to tell him that, but he wouldn't believe me. He'd always tell me it was because we had been together from time we were 3. I knew him too well, he'd say. I couldn't tell the difference between his strong points and his flaws. They were all the same to me. He couldn't change my mind about him, though. I went on loving him just the same, and I could never quite be interested in anyone else. And then, back to back, here's some 1Q84. The taxi's radio was tuned to a classical FM broadcast, Janek's Sinfonietta. Probably not the ideal music to hear in a taxi caught in traffic. The middle-aged driver didn't seem to be listening very closely either. With his mouth clamped shut, he stared straight ahead at the endless line of cars stretched out on the elevated expressway. Like a veteran fisherman standing in the bow of his boat, reading the ominous confluence of two currents, Eomame settled into the broad back seat, closed her eyes, and listened to the music. These all are very different voices. Every single one of these are very different. However, the tonality of the ones with J. Rubin have a simplicity to them, where there is a complexity to Gabriel's translations instead. And I don't know if this is due to translation or if this is due to Murakami, but I can say that my experience reading Sputnik Sweetheart was extremely different. Now, what is Sputnik Sweetheart about? This is essentially a love triangle in which Kay likes Samire, but Samire is focused on her writing career. But Samire falls for Mio, this sophisticated business woman. But Samire goes missing, and Kay falls into this hunt for Samire through Samire's writings, through Samire's own entries. That is how Kay interacts with hunting down Samire. The term Sputnik Sweetheart was Samire's nickname for Mio. That is his title. But in this concept of the eye and in this concept of how Murakami is writing, Sputnik Sweetheart felt so extremely different from these other books because it is a reflection of Murakami's self through Sumire. All these other books were this discussion and this reflection and this sharing of memories. I feel like Murakami was so focused on sharing memories and sharing class thoughts and sharing thoughts about the world, but there is a more personal note to Sputnik Sweetheart, and the way the story weaves is much more beautifully written, in my opinion. I don't have too many parts of the plot that I want to talk about because, again, this was another one where it's just like, oh, there's some loving happened, there's a man, and it's complicated love. The concept of complicated love and this feeling of this haunted house nature of unrequited love is the story. That is it. You don't really need much from it. But this almost like humid, melancholic, swollen story, while also being once again so empty. And I think it goes back to maybe Murakami talking about this neutrality, but unrequited love is an empty theme. So for this story to be so waterlogged, but then to essentially be for naught, it really makes it feel like I'm getting the same feeling hammered into me over and over and over and over again. And I don't know what to do with that knowledge. I don't know. But again, it's this idea of that Japanese eye novel, this inner reflection. Murakami only has 5 thoughts that he really cares about writing. And it's essentially his diary entries fleshed out through these characters. But after that, I'm not getting much. This was my favorite in writing. And the short stories were technically kind of my favorite because I could speed through them a little bit better. I didn't like all of the short stories. They all weren't that great. But not having 400, 300 pages of something that just felt like I was sitting still in an empty room felt better. But at the same time, I've got to say, Murakami is not for me. I know I spent that whole section of the video arguing that Murakami isn't a misogynist. I get that. But still existing so close to this male gaze and there's a scene in Norwegian Wood where there's a character, Midori, the one interested in Toru. Midori was Toru's situationship in college, in which Midori is begging Toru to perform oral on him. And she's like, my boyfriend didn't like me being so freaky, and all I want to do is put my mouth on a man part, and I would love it so much. And then he's like, oh yeah, I kind of like that. And then she's like, can I see your bits? And he's like, yeah, you can look at it. And she's goes under the covers, looks at his parts, and she's like, it's perfect. This is the most beautiful one I've ever seen in my life. It's so perfect and so beautiful. And he's like, much thanks. Much thanks. Thank you for liking it. And then they do the thing, and then and she's like, wow, it's so much. It was just weird to experience male fantasy written in this way, to experience male gaze written this way. There's no point in which I was like, oh, he hates women. It was like, oh, this man just really likes boobs. This man just really likes long legs. And it really feels as if his college fantasies are just written out, and I didn't really enjoy existing within that. I didn't enjoy. While I can say there was no point in which this is misogynistic literature, that doesn't mean that I was enjoying the male gaze literature. Male gaze is not something that I liked. And I did a lot of research trying to find if Murakami was playing to a social norm or a social structure, or if he was making a commentary against media. Nope. He's just a boob-loving man. That's all it is. It feels as if Murakami has all of these fans and all of these people interested in him, but it's a very boy book. A very boy book. The female characters being head over heels for this man. And there's one girl in a scene where she's like, I'm in love with you because you can conjugate verbs in English. You're so good at translation and you're good at math, and I love you because of that. I've fallen in love because you're so smart, because you can math. And it just feels like male fantasy. And Murakami is doing this confessional writing. And are you just confessing to us what you want in a woman, or like the secret things that you maybe can't say out loud? That you're so interested in a pair of boobs? Is that what you're saying? But in that interview that I was talking about, where Kawakami and Murakami are having that conversation, the discussion of him bringing up boobs comes up again, because there's a female character who, when she meets a male character, she's like, don't you think my boobs are too small? And the way a lot of people read that scene is to say, oh, this female character is immediately sexualizing herself. But Kawakami says, she's a little too fixated though. The second she's alone with the first person narrator, the guy she's never met before, the first words out of her mouth are something like, my breasts are really small, don't you think? I found this pretty surprising. Where does this obsession with breasts come from? Murakami responds, I wouldn't really say it comes from anywhere. I just imagine that girls are out here and they feel this way. Kawakami, but what about the gap between her and the narrator? When she starts asking him about her breasts, did you struggle at all over how he should respond? Murakami, I know what you're saying, but the fact that she asks him for his opinion on her breasts suggests that she doesn't really see him as a man. She doesn't recognize him as a sexual object. This strengthens the introspectiveness or philosophical nature of their dialogue. That's the sort of relationship that she wants from him. I have a feeling she's been searching for a while for a person she can ask about this stuff. I think we can agree that, generally speaking, if you see a chance of becoming a sexual object in someone's eyes, you don't start off by talking about how your breasts aren't growing or how small your nipples are. I hate that Murakami seems to so deeply not understand women, but also kind of hit it on the head. When I'm comfortable with somebody and I don't see them as this possible thing that would treat me in an overly sexual manner, there are discussion topics that I'm far more comfortable bringing up to them. But on a different hand, it feels like Murakami genuinely doesn't understand women. And this is because, like, there's no discussion where we're arguing and saying, oh, Murakami's lying. Oh, Murakami isn't being honest during these interviews. We don't get anywhere if we don't just take his word for it. So I'm just going to take his word that he just thinks women think this way. And maybe women are just insecure about their boobs. I'm insecure about my boobs and I brought it up as well. So like my guy friends, I've literally brought it up like, hey, boobs aren't in anymore, right? Like you guys don't care about these things. Like I brought it up. I have. But his doesn't feel like it comes from a place of malice. But that doesn't mean I enjoyed being within his mind. I can see this interest in him on a Japanese standpoint in culture because of his pop culture references and the difference in how he writes and the difference technically in how his writing is coming out. But in an English-speaking perspective, existing so intimately with the male gaze, it really felt like this filter was taken off, and I just got to see into a man's mind for all of his books. None of these got over a 3-star for me. My highest rating was a 3-star, which I view as a very average reading experience, not anything that I would recommend to anybody. The Norwegian Wood and After Dark were 1 stars. And then the Elephant Vanishes and 1Q84 were 2 stars for me. These were not necessarily enjoyable reading experiences. And I think it would have been a bit better if there was some purpose in his writing. I do think that if but at the same time, who am I to tell him what to do? Who am I to tell Murakami, like, put some purpose in your books? He just wanted to exist. He just wanted to hang out with his characters. And I just personally would love if my characters had a drive, a motive, and there was a plot and essentially a path through which I was taken on this story, rather than like, we're just vibing through this night and we just bumped into some prostitutes and, oh, there's some boobs here. Murakami is just a boob man. But I do want to say also, Japanese culture isn't a butt culture. It's a boob culture. So we're also just seeing Japanese beauty standards pushed out in very much a male fantasy kind of way. And I think that we're overusing the term misogynistic. And would I recommend this book to anybody? I can't think of the kind of person. Yes, I do. I would recommend this book to some of my guy friends. Guys who like literary fiction, I can't see them picking this up. Not because I think all men think this way, but in like, I'm sure a guy could read this and go like, I had thoughts like that back in high school. You know, I could see a guy doing that. Like, like I used to think this way. like I could see this being funny. I could see Murakami's humor hitting a man harder than it hit me, because I just kind of felt a little weird. I felt a little bit on the outside of a boys' club, but I can see a man laughing at it. I can't see me laughing at it because I just felt a little icky. I didn't feel objectified. I just felt like those were thoughts I didn't need to know. That's all I have for you. That is my little bit of a hangout with Haruki Murakami. I feel like I've been sitting here for days talking about this guy. This was fun. Please, if you've read any of his books, please comment down below how you felt about it. Please argue with me. Please tell me that I'm wrong. I am so open to you just saying like, hey, you're wrong and you don't understand anything, because I don't. I'm simply somebody with access to the internet and a little bit of reading comprehension, not even that much. If you read any of these books or you read any other Haruki Murakami's, please tell me how you felt. Please, when you talk about it, tell me who the translator is. I really think that matters. Philip Gabriel is my favorite. I do think that he puts in something a bit more poetic and flowing into his books that J. Rubin just isn't hitting. At the end of the day, I think this became a competition of translators. I hope you're having an amazing week and I hope you're reading good books. Please comment down below if you have any thoughts on Murakami, or if you have anything to open my eyes up to reading Murakami, or anything that you know, or different lenses through which I can read his books. I do need it. And I will talk to you next time.